Hello, and welcome to DRADIS Contact, the unofficial Battlestar Galactica the board game podcast. We are your hosts, Nick and AJ, and in this podcast we aim to celebrate and promote this beloved board game.
In this episode we plan to give you an overview of the expansions released for BSG and try to tackle the controversial subject about which expansions are essential. As always, we'll kick off with the news. The first is that we've had something of a hiatus since our first episode. We had to figure out our schedules and our editing, which we've done so now, and looking forward to 2025 and getting a good series of episodes out to you.
Our next regular news item is to discuss the Board Game Geek ranking, and I'm sorry to report that Battlestar Galactica continues to fall down the rankings. It's currently, at the time of recording, ranked 109. I mean, it's not unexpected. We've talked before about how it's, an old game that's out of print. It's really up against it to try and stay high in the rankings against so many, newer games with all the promotion they're getting and the recency bias. I'm content that we keep doing what we're doing. We keep kind of trying to promote the game. If anybody hasn't yet ranked it, please do either log into Board Game Geek or create an account there and rank it highly. I'd love to see it sort of stay known and stay relevant.
A few months ago, Variety reported that the Battlestar Galactica television series reboot that was in production by Peacock has been cancelled. I'm in two minds about this one. In the ideal scenario, new episodes or a new part of the franchise could have led to renewed interest, which could have inevitably led to more people coming to the game, or best case scenario, a new version of the game, as unlikely as that sounds. However, what was more likely to happen is that the new version would likely take away from the original show, especially since, as we know, none of the original producers or cast were involved. So, at least in this way, the original show remains untouched. We don't need any more. We don't need any more remixes or takes on the original show like Blood and Chrome tried to do. So, at least this way, we can keep it as it is and keep enjoying the game.
Yeah, I think I feel similarly about it. Would have been great to see new episodes if they were done to a high standard, but it's quite nice to, I guess, have the show as it was sort of preserved in, largely unadulterated fashion.
And the last piece of news for today is that Creation Entertainment recently held a convention to celebrate Battlestar Galactica's 20th anniversary, the show having launched in 2004. What was really nice to see about the convention is that Michael Hogan attended. Now, Michael Hogan was, he played Sultai in the original television series, in the reimagined television series, I should say. He was injured at a convention in 2020 and has been on a road to recovery since. So really nice to see him taking part in conventions again and returning to that scene. And hopefully there'll be further conventions like this in the future, one of which we'd like to attend, as difficult that is from the UK where we're based.
So in part one of our feature this week, we want to give you an overview of some of the different expansions that have released for BSG. This won't be, I don't think, a slavish listing of what's included, but we'll try and talk through the components, how they change the game, and our opinions and recommendations for them. We're going to try and steer clear of a particular reference to player counts because we're planning on covering that in a future episode.
So the first expansion that came out for the game was in 2008. It's credited to Corey Konietzko himself. And it's the official variant rules. It includes 4 different ways to play the game. And as Nick mentioned, we won't go too deep into the 2-player and 1-player game variants that are included therein. We'll talk about those a bit more in the player count episode, which we're going to do in the future. There are still 2 variants that it is worth talking about. First one is the fully cooperative game. Now, in researching for this episode, I realised that the fully cooperative game is the only module of any expansion that I've never played for BSG, and I can't say I have any desire to. What it does is it reduces your initial resources, it gives you only 1 nuke, and it removes some of the cards that are about the intrigue and about inspecting each other's loyalty cards, and basically allows you to play the game completely cooperative. I think that probably takes away from BSG what makes the game great. So not a module I plan on visiting at any time.
Yeah, I think I'd agree that the jeopardy and the paranoia are what make the games exciting, aren't they? I think if you strip that out, then you might as well play a dedicated cooperative game. I think it's it's decent of them to have included it, so it's an option there if you're a fan of cooperative games, but not what I look for when I'm playing BSG.
Yeah. Perhaps the most important module in the official variant rules is the no sympathizer variant. So there is a flaw in the base game when you're playing with 4 or 6 players, that the sympathizer role, which it basically has its loyalty decided at the sleeper phase, can be gamed by the players. So what happens is that if the human team has any single resource in the red, as in below half by the time of sleeper phase, the sympathizer becomes human loyal. And if the humans are doing too well, as in all the resources are in the blue, the sympathizer becomes a revealed Cylon with slightly neutered abilities. What this meant was that players could game the outcome by just tanking one resource to make sure it's in the red to ensure that we get a human player at the sleeper phase from the sympathizer. So what the no sympathizer variant does is it reduces your resources slightly and adds an extra skill card for revealed Cylons in exchange for not having this sympathizer mechanism. And you often see this recommended when people talk about playing the base game at 4 or 6 players.
So the first expansion to release for BSG was Pegasus, and this came out in 2009. It was an independent box, but required the base game to play, so it's a genuine expansion. And it tracks and aims to recreate the narrative of what occurred in Season 2 of the show. So discovery of Battlestar Pegasus and the events of New Caprica.
So the design of Pegasus is credited to Corey, of course, but also Daniel Lovett-Clark and Tim Uren. And Tim Uren is a name that's going to appear quite a lot as we talk about expansions. He's basically involved in every expansion from this point onwards. He's on the Mount Rushmore of BSG designers. He's the Thomas Jefferson allegory. He's the one who's all about growth and expansion of the game series.
Oh wow! Have you got this planned out for the other designers as well? Have we got more of this coming?
I have the Mount Rushmore of Battlestar Galactica board game designers fully lined up in my head, and
okay. I can't wait to hear it.
Just to clarify, of course, George Washington is Corey Konietzko.
Of course, yeah, naturally.
There could be no other. The founder.
Indeed.
So the Pegasus expansion, it's interesting the way that it's framed. The intentions of the designers seem to be to fix a few of the issues with the base game, add on a new ending to the experience with the new Caprica board, and bring in some additional characters and options. And the way that it's all framed in the rules is that you as a default, you integrate everything and you play with all of it. And it's only towards the end of the rulebook in the variant section that they talk about removing some of these items. So their intended design philosophy was that you would integrate the new Caprica ending, all the new characters, all the new skill cards, and play it with everything all in. What's interesting about that is that there are parts of it that people really don't like. I think we can all agree that New Caprica is the worst destination that you can pick for a BSG ending. So many people did take the variant of not including that in their games and just took everything else that the expansion offered.
So a significant new inclusion is, of course, Battlestar Pegasus, and the Pegasus expansion introduces the Pegasus game board. So Pegasus behaves a bit like Colonial 1 from the base game in that you can move to this ship as part of the fleet, discarding a skill card to go there, and it opens up a number of powerful new locations. Each of them some of them are kind of a sort of amped up version of locations that you already have on Galactica, and a couple that are new powerful locations. The first one I think is probably worth talking about is the airlock location, which allows you to choose a character, pass a skill check with a difficulty of 12, and execute that character.
And this is something interesting that not a lot of people may realise, is that execution isn't in the base game. If people have only played with Pegasus and or Exodus, they may think that execution is a key mechanic of BSG. In fact, it was introduced in Pegasus, most prevalently on the Pegasus board, but also in some of the other cards. It does change a lot of the way the game works. I enjoy execution as a mechanism. but I do feel that the threat of it can have a greater impact than execution itself. The idea that a player could be executed and have to pick a new character can have a significant impact on the game. Once it happens, there's some administration involved, and sometimes there's some issues about if they pick a character that has some type of setup ability, then you have to look up exactly what happens when they come back, and it can be a bit of an issue. But it's an exciting mechanism, and it gets revisited again in Exodus, which we'll come to in a little while.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other new location on Pegasus is the engine room, which allows a player that goes there to discard 2 skill cards to treat the next crisis card drawn as if it had a prepare for jump icon, which allows you to make headway along the jump track, which can be just left to chance if you're just drawing out crisis cards as in the base game. I think the other thing to say with Pegasus is that anytime Galactica would be damaged, you can choose to relocate this damage to Pegasus. And this does allow Pegasus to be something of a damage sink, because Pegasus isn't mission critical. If Pegasus gets destroyed, then it's no longer available for play. Any players that are there are sent to the sick bay, but the game carries on thereafter. So it kind of does give you a way to absorb damage and put it into a non-critical place, which I guess changes the game balance a little bit.
I think overall, the elements introduced in Pegasus make the game slightly easier for the humans. Pegasus being a damage sink, Pegasus offering some slightly more powerful options in terms of locations, even if they come with downsides in some cases, give the humans more of an ability to get out of some tight squeezes. Another change that we see in the Pegasus expansion is a change to the way that the silent locations work. We've got an overlay included in the expansion. The resurrection ship is the biggest change. It becomes a hazardous location, so you can't keep going there to cycle out your Super Crisis card until you find one that you like. But also the way that the excess loyalty cards of a revealed Cylon are handed off is changed, because instead of utilising the resurrection ship to do that, you actually do that as soon as you reveal as part of the reveal process. So if 6 or less distance has been travelled, you'll hand off your excess loyalty cards to another player, potentially turning them into a Cylon. And this removes the ability of revealed Cylon players to choose their moment of when to do that by utilising the resurrection ship. There was a possibility in the base game of a bad feeling if a human player was turned into a Cylon at the very last minute, just before a human win, and then had to take part in a Cylon loss they'd had no part in. So it's a small change that makes a big difference to the game, and in fact every subsequent expansion continues on this rules change.
I think it definitely adds another element to Asylum reveal, doesn't it? And it just creates more tension and paranoia around the table as you see those loyalty cards get handed around.
There's some minor fixes in the Pegasus expansion, notably the investigative committee skill cards, which now only allow you to look at the cards played by players during a skill check as face up, rather than not the ones that were dealt from the Destiny deck. A small change would just keep some of the intrigue and stops the skill check being completely gamed utilising investigative committee.
On the subject of skill cards, Pegasus also introduces the new Treachery skill card deck, which wasn't present in the base game. This is a brown coloured deck that by and large doesn't feature any skill checks, so can be used to effectively spike skills. It is present in the airlock execution skill check, and many of these cards feature skill check abilities that can trigger at the end of a skill check with various negative connotations.
And the key thing about the treachery cards in Pegasus, they can actually be played by revealed Cylons to cause negative impact on the human players. In Pegasus, we've also got a new character type called the Cylon Leader. So during the character selection at the beginning of the game, if a player decides to pick a Cylon Leader, no one else is able to pick one. And what that player does is they play as a revealed Cylon whose ultimate agenda remains unknown to the other players. And what they do is they draw an agenda card which tells them whether they are aligned to the humans or aligned to the Cylons. And they can utilise Cylon locations or human locations by infiltrating Galactica and moving around ostensibly as a human player once they're infiltrating. It's a really interesting way of dealing with the 4 and 6 player game. It's also required if you wish to play at 7 players as well. And it's a nice alternative to the sympathizer or the sympathetic Cylon that's also included.
The Pegasus expansion was the first time that we see plastic base stars. So I had to remind myself that these weren't in the base game. The base game represented the base stars just by 2 cardboard cutouts. And I appreciate, we've come a long way since Pegasus was released. Probably should be thinking slightly more about sustainability. But I do really quite like the plastic base stars. I think they give a lot more board presence to what are meant to be, an intimidating capital ship that you're facing. And I think also, the cardboard base stars are just at risk of getting scuffed with repeated play. So yeah, I accept it's probably not the most sustainable option, but I'm a big fan of the plastic base stars. Sorry, my guilty pleasure. Yeah,
I think Pegasus expansion is completely essential for that one reason alone. Got to play the plastic base stars. So we should talk in a bit more depth about the elephant in the room, which is the New Caprica destination that's included in the Pegasus expansion. What happens here is once you've reached 7 distance, as opposed to 8 distance in the base game, the characters are transferred to a separate board, the New Caprica board, where the humans are attempting to launch the escape ships to escape from New Caprica and get back into space before the fleet jumps away. There's quite a lot of power put onto the Admiral in this part of the game, because the Admiral actually makes the decision about when to jump the fleet, and anyone who doesn't make it up into space is left behind. So it's quite there's an opportunity for some excitement, but the game really slows down while everyone runs around the New Caprica board, and the mechanisms aren't very well implemented in this portion. There's a reason why I think most people now don't play with New Caprica at all.
Yeah, you can see what they try to do here, and it's obviously, recreating the events as seen in the TV show. It just feels quite jarring. It's sort of a very strange change of pace and change of direction to come when you've already travelled a distance 7, and it makes it a slightly, I think, dissatisfying end to the game.
So overall, Pegasus seems to turn everything up to 11. You've got more powerful characters, more powerful cards, some interesting locations, but I do find there's less nuance than in the base game. So you've got people like Admiral Kane, fantastic character in the show, played by Michelle Forbes, and a really interesting character in the game, but very overpowered. She's able to, if she passes a skill check on the Admiral's quarters, she can execute the player instead of putting them in the brig. And at one point during the game, she can sacrifice 2 civilian ships in order to immediately jump the ship. So very powerful for both a Cylon and a human player, especially given the fact that she outranks Adama and will always start as the Admiral. And this is typical, I find, of the content that's added in Pegasus. It's really exciting, it's really flashy, but it takes away from the more intricate nuance of the base game.
Yeah, I think you've summed it up really well, haven't you? I think they've done a good job of recreating just how ruthless she was in the show, and as you say, played fantastically by Michelle Forbes. But I do have concerns that she just interrupts that sort of delicate line of succession and balance that was established in the base game. Because Adama was going to be the Admiral, he felt slightly underpowered in the rest of his abilities, whereas Kane doesn't have any of those weaknesses. I think I've been tempted to pick Kane in the past as well, just because, as you alluded to earlier, execution just sounds so cool. But actually, as I recall, I don't think I actually executed anybody, just because, yeah, it just felt like there was too much jeopardy if I picked the wrong person. I think in that game I was playing as a human, and I didn't want to cause us the morale loss. So even if you've picked her and you've got the ability to execute somebody, you don't always actually get to carry it out.
Mm-hmm. I think what you said is important, that when Pegasus is integrated, I don't know if anyone would ever pick Adama, because, like you said, he's slightly lower powered to account for the fact he was starting as Admiral in the base game. Kane's clearly the more powerful choice, and once he's picked, do you really want to play a military character that is just slightly lower ranked than her, that with no other positive ability, with only with a less powerful main ability? So without Pegasus, you see those characters still get picked.
So with this being the first expansion, we see a few new design ideas that aren't repeated or carried through to subsequent expansions. These include movement actions, which are specific actions on skill checks that allow you to perform them if you choose not to move that turn, and reckless skill checks, which represent the human players cutting corners, often lowering the difficulty of a skill check, but then potentially having negative interactions, particularly with treachery cards. I think both of these things were designed to give human players more agency, a bit more control over the skill checks, and a bit more action economy, but we don't see them repeated in any of the subsequent expansions. So obviously these were design choices that weren't followed up on.
It's interesting to look at the design elements that come in Pegasus and then aren't touched on again, even later on with expansion like Daybreak that tries to re-implement a lot of what was in Pegasus. These items aren't revisited, and in fact they conflict with some of the later expansions, as we'll get on to later. It's the same with the sympathetic Cylon module. It was an interesting variant added in Pegasus that was another alternative to Sympathizer. So again, that issue with the Sympathizer being recognised. For anyone who didn't want to utilise the no Sympathizer variant, there was now a sympathetic Cylon who would receive an agenda card, which would determine their loyalty, in the same way that a Cylon leader would. So, but again, we don't see that revisited, and we see other attempts at fixing the 4 and 6 player game in other expansions.
So the second expansion we want to talk to you about today, and the second one released for BSG, is the Exodus expansion, designed again by Corey Konieczka and Tim Uren. This released in 2010 and details the events of Season 3 of the TV show.
So the way the Exodus expansion is framed is with 3 modules, all of which significantly change the game and are designed to work with one or more elements of the base game. So we've got Conflicted Loyalties, which adds personal goals and Final 5 cards. We've got the Cylon Fleet Board, which changes the way the combat works. And there's the Ionian Nebula, which is a new destination, which completely changes the end game.
So I think the first and sort of most significant change that Exodus introduces is the Cylon Fleet Board. So in the base game, Cylon attacks, or Cylon ships rather, are placed through Cylon attack cards, which come out of the Crisis deck. And when you complete a jump cycle, so you get into the jump track, you jump away, and any ships on the board are removed and put to one side. Exodus introduces the Cylon Fleet Board, and what this represents is that the Cylons are continuing their pursuit of the fleet. So any time that Galactica completes a jump cycle, ships that were in that space around Galactica, that numbered space around Galactica, are transferred instead to the Cylon Fleet Board and continue their pursuit. At the top of the Cylon Fleet Board is a pursuit track, and there are certain game effects that will move the pursuit marker, and when the Cylons have completed their own jump cycle, then those ships jump back into the main game board and attack Galactica. This really changes the ebb and flow of the base game. This, to me, is sort of very reminiscent of the first episode of the TV series after the miniseries, 33, in that it ratchets up the tension significantly. You are under continual threat of attack. There can be a significant number of ships on board, which can be thrilling in its own right, having that threat. But I think it also detracts a little bit from the kind of the natural pace of the game. The fact that in the base game, when you jump away, it does kind of create time for people to make power plays, political machinations, try and seize a title. I feel like you have less time for that because the game feels a bit more frantic when you're playing with the Cylon Fleet Board. In addition, the centre of the Cylon Fleet Board is the Base Star Bridge, and these can be activated by revealed Cylons. And it gives them incredibly powerful abilities, of which they get to choose 2. And I think it gives the revealed Cylons a little bit too much fine control over dictating the way in which they want to particularly punish the humans. I think the humans are often up against it anyway. To give the Cylons that kind of control over exactly what deleterious effects are happening to the humans just seems to me to be a little bit overpowered.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the Cylon Fleet board is the most divisive module in any of the expansions. Some people feel it fixes an element of the base game, which was the irregularity of attack cards coming out of the Crisis deck. And some people, myself included, feel that unpredictable nature of the Cylon attacks in the base game is part of what makes the base game so good. That you might have an entire jump cycle with no attacks, and you spend all of that time vying for power until eventually a Cylon fleet jumps in and you get a couple of attack cards in a row, and you all have to somehow bring yourself back together to tackle the external threats. I think it must be that some players really enjoy that continued tension that comes with the constant threat of the Cylon fleet board, of that Cylon fleet jumping in. I certainly agree with your point that the Cylon locations that are on the Battlestar bridge are incredibly powerful, and 2 revealed Cylons, and I've seen this myself, working in tandem, utilising locations on that bridge, can completely neutralise the human efforts to progress their own jump track and lead to a stalled game, a very long game through doing that. That was quite a negative game experience when I've seen it, and I think given how powerful those locations are, I think this also leads to early reveals, where sometimes the best thing to do for a Cylon is reveal themselves, head over to the Battlestar bridge and start hitting those really powerful actions, which to me is not what I want the game to encourage. That being said, still enjoy this module. I will play it if that's how people enjoy playing the game. It's just not my favourite module to play with.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth saying that, this has introduced the CAG title, the Commander of the Air Group, and it does give pilots a lot more utility. In the base game, if there's not much happening in the way of Cylon attack cards, then pilots can often be maybe a bit frustrated with their lack of usefulness. I mean, having continual Cylon attacks does make it quite thrilling to be a pilot.
I would probably argue it goes too far the other way. So I do agree with what you're saying, that in the base game, pilots can sometimes feel like they don't have much to do if there aren't Cylon ships attacking. Often when you're playing with a Cylon fleet board, pilots are the only important players on the game board, and everyone is expected to executive order the pilots with every action they have. So the President's not searching the Quorum deck, they're executive ordering the pilots. We're not scouting the Crisis deck, we're executive ordering pilots. And anyone who doesn't do that is immediately then cast with suspicion for why you're not exec ordering that pilot and instead doing something else. So I think it takes away lots. The pilots get loads to do, but I think it impacts the rest of the game negatively.
Yeah, I think that's so true, isn't it? That kind of reinforces what we were saying earlier about the kind of the natural ebb and flow of playing without the Cylon fleet board, and you lose some of that. You lose some of the individuality, and the other roles become just completely de-emphasized.
So next, let's talk a little bit about conflicted loyalties. I really appreciate this module. What they were trying to do was create more variability in the loyalty cards, and also give players a good reason to keep checking their loyalty cards, which is a welcome solution to the issue of not being able to recheck what your card says if you're a Cylon in the base game. So what the conflicted loyalties do is they introduce 2 possible types of loyalty card. You can use either or both. The personal goals give you things that must be achieved during the game. As an action, you can reveal the card if it has been achieved, and that will then avoid a resource loss at the end of the game. There's also the final 5 cards, which have some kind of negative ability if they're ever inspected. So if someone looks at the card, for example, using Gaius Baltar's ability to inspect the face on loyalty card, there might be something negative, like one of the players gets executed, for example. Adds a little bit of intrigue to the loyalty card mechanisms, which is welcome. On a bigger issue, it's worth talking about the change in the way that the loyalty deck works now with Exodus. After an additional loyalty card, an additional You Are Not a Cylon card is added to the deck at the beginning of the game. And whenever a player is executed or completes a personal goal, an additional You Are Not a Cylon card is shuffled into that deck. And they then draw from what cards are in there. So what this means is that you can't game the loyalty cards by executing everyone until you found all the Cylons, because what you might be doing is creating a Cylon, if that's the card that's been left in the deck. And additionally, when you complete your personal goals, you may draw into another personal goal that then has to be completed. So it's an interesting dynamic. The only thing is you have to be very careful to manage the different loyalty decks. So you'll have your normal loyalty deck, you'll have a you are not a Cylon deck, and you'll have a you are a Cylon deck. And you have to be careful that you deal cards from the correct ones and you shuffle the correct ones in, because you can't check any of them once the game started. And I did once make a mistake where I dealt everyone's loyalty cards from the you are not a Cylon deck, and we had a fully cooperative game for the first half of the game until I realised. So perhaps I was lying when I said that the fully cooperative game was the only one I've not tried, because I did it by accident once.
Those are the kind of things that come back to haunt you.
Yes, the horror that dawned on me when I realised what I'd done, and that we'd been playing for an hour and a half, got to sleeper phase, and there were no Cylons, and if I didn't do something quick to fix the game, there would be no Cylons for the remainder of the game.
How did you resolve that in the end?
I shuffled 2 you are a Cylon cards into the deck, ensuring there was the correct number, and dealt out from there. And I didn't tell anyone what had happened so that everyone else could have a good game experience and only I'd know.
Wow, good save.
Well, everyone else had a good time.
So one thing we do see in Exodus is the introduction of some characters that are significantly overpowered in my view. 2 I want to mention in particular are Callie, who is a support character. Now, she's got an amazing skill card selection from which she can draw. Her regular ability is that she may discard 1 card from a skill check before resolving it on her turn. And her once per game ability is that she may execute another character in her location. I mean, this is just crazy powerful. Her weakness isn't even that bad. She may not contribute 1 card to a skill check. She has to put in 0 or 2, except for a brig check. So this is a character that I think has, significant game-changing effects, and not really much of a weakness. In the support role, I think she's far outclasses any of the other characters.
Yeah, she's hugely fun if you're playing as her. There's a lot of tension if she's in the game, but it's not a subtle character. Everyone is constantly afraid of being executed on the spot if she gets turned into a Cylon, or if she just decides she doesn't like you.
Yeah, I think I've been there before, where you're having to flee Callie, basically moving from ship to ship. The other character that I want to mention here is Tori Foster, who is a political leader, and she's just really a presidential beast, basically, because her regular ability is that she's adaptable. So anytime a player uses an action from a quorum card, she can draw 2 of any skill card. So she has an amazing ability to draw skill cards outside of her default hand draw. She gets a lot of action economy and efficiency from playing quorum cards as being the president. And her once per game ability is that she can look at the top 5 quorum cards and put them back on the deck in any order that she wishes. Her weakness is that on her turn she must choose the first option on any current player chooses card, which is incredibly thematic for the character in the show. And in fact, although this is her character's weakness, in some ways it gives you the perfect cover, whether or not you're playing as a human or a Cylon. Nobody can really scrutinize your actions on the crisis card, because you have no control over it. You have to choose the first option. So if you're getting away with choosing or being forced to choose what are negative options, well, nobody can use that to gain any insight over who you might be playing for.
It's also worth briefly mentioning Gator as well. He's not as overpowered as Callie or as Tori, but he's a fun character to play as. He's able to steal the Admiral title, and he gets a free get out of brick free card when he does that for his once per game ability, which is good fun. But overall, the characters in Exodus, again, as what we saw in Pegasus, feel like fun ideas, interesting and powerful abilities put onto characters, as if someone thought, what would be fun things that we could do with these characters, it's appreciated, but again, we lose the nuance of the base game. The interaction between those 10 original characters, and how each of them had subtle abilities that worked against each other, kind of goes out the airlock when you've got a character who can shoot someone in the face. So yes, it's fun, and I enjoy playing with Exodus, but it's a much more swingy and a much more dramatic game, not always for the better. So let's talk about the third big module that's included in the Exodus expansion. That's the Ionian Nebula. This creates a it changes a lot of what's happening in the game. So you have allies that are dispersed amongst around Galactica and Colonial 1, who you'll interact with on your turn. They can have positive or negative impacts, and what's going to happen over the game is you're going to accumulate trauma of different types. The trauma will come into play at the end of the game, where you go through what's called the crossroads phase, where your character faces a major decision or a major crossroads in their life. So, for example, going on trial, as Baltar was at the end of Season 3. That crossroads mechanic is really fun, because the different decisions and the different ways you can go are genuinely game-changing. So that's really good fun. And what happens then at the end of the game is you go into the Battle of the Ionian Nebula, where a huge fleet jumps in, and players can actually be completely eliminated from the game, as opposed to being executed and coming back. There's an opportunity at the end of the game for someone to be completely knocked out. So it's very, it's good fun. I'd like to play the Ionian Nebula every now and then, because it's quite a dramatic finish to the game. It includes some good moments. It does lengthen the game a bit because of the additional administration you have to do with the allies, but it's worth it, I think, every now and again. I wouldn't use it all the time, because there's a purity to the game when you're not doing all those things, but worthwhile once in a while. So as we've talked about, the way that the expansion is laid out is you have these 3 modules that you can implement: the Conflicted Loyalties, the Silent Fleet, and the Ionian Nebula, in any combination you wish. However, it seems clear that the intention for the expansion is to utilise the Silent Fleet. And the reason for that is there are no additional silent attack cards provided amongst the new Crisis cards. So if you integrate the Exodus expansion with the new Crisis cards, but don't put in the Silent Fleet, you just have a diluted silent attack regularity in the deck, and the silent attacks will be even less regular than they were in the base game. That definitely doesn't seem like something the designers would have intended, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say that they were intending that you play with a Silent Fleet board when you play with Exodus.
So I think overall Exodus has got a lot to offer. It certainly can drive it in new and interesting ways. There's certainly a lot more going on in terms of personal goals. But I think overall it can feel a little bit chaotic, particularly at higher player counts.
Yeah, I think Exodus gets really chaotic at those higher player counts, because you've got more personal goals, you've got more impact of a necessity to executive order the pilots, and you've got the chance of 2 consecutive Cylon players sat on the Cylon fleet board. So I think conversely, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a player count episode, I think Exodus works really nicely at 3 players, because you generally have a title each. You can manage your pilots and CAG actions a lot easier, and there's less incentive to pick Cali. So overall, there's a good option for it there at 3 players. So next up, we'll talk about the Daybreak expansion, which was released in 2013, designed by James Niffin and Tim Uren. And again, just circling back to the Mount Rushmore of Battlestar Galactica designers, James Niffin I'd put on as the Abraham Lincoln allegory about essentially the preservation of the game. Given that Daybreak, as we'll talk about, is kind of BSG 2.0, it's the Daybreak expansion that keeps the game alive, I think, for a lot of us, and keeps the game enjoyable and gives it its replayability. And further, James went on to design New Angeles, which was Fantasy Flight's first attempt at recreating the feeling of BSG in a game once they'd lost the IP to actually print BSG itself.
So one of the most fundamental changes that we see in Daybreak is the introduction of the Mutiny deck. So Mutiny cards feed into a number of the other design elements in Daybreak, such as interactions with Colonial 1 and the new role that replaces the Sympathizer role, the Mutineer, which we're going to come on to talk about a bit later on. Mutiny cards have actions on them, often with a mixture of effects, some positive, some negative. So for instance, it may say that you can advance the jump track by 1 place, but in order to do so you have to destroy a Viper. The reason that you're going to want to get rid of Mutiny cards is that if you're ever in possession of 2 Mutiny cards, then your player becomes brigged. You get to choose 1 to discard, but you hold on to 1 so you don't clear your Mutiny deck entirely, and then you're at jeopardy of being brigged again in the future. So players are going to want to try and get rid of Mutiny cards where possible. it can be possible that the action that you'd have to perform to get rid of the mutiny card becomes impossible and that you're stuck with it for the rest of the game. The reason I think mutiny cards are such a powerful and clever game effect is that they, again, give additional cover to people doing things that seem to be slightly non-altruistic. You may be performing an action that will be harming the human fleet. Be pleased to do so because you're secretly a Cylon. Yeah, so mutiny cards provide another avenue for players to act in questionable ways that may not be completely apparent to those around the table.
Yeah, so as you said, mutiny feeds into a lot of the other mechanisms that we see in Daybreak. The way that the presidential title is transferred or stolen, now instead of being a skill check, is now handled through mutiny cards. So using a new location or a revised location on Colonial 1, you can give mutiny cards to the president, and then you can then effectively impeach them by targeting a president who has a mutiny card and utilising that mechanism to take the presidency off them. The mutiny cards also form the basis for the new conflicted role that comes with Daybreak, which is the mutineer. The mutineer replaces the sympathiser from the base game. What it does is it's a role that is more likely to draw mutiny cards, but also can hold two of them and only goes to the brig on holding a third. There's some interesting ways the mutineer can be played. They can actually choose to sit in the brig, keep drawing mutiny cards with impunity, and effectively from the brig play these actions to help or hinder the fleet, which can be quite thematic. There is some criticism of the mutineer role because a cooperative mutineer on the human team can agree to go and sit in the brig in the method I just mentioned, and effectively it'd be a mutiny sink for the other players. So whenever anyone is forced to draw mutiny cards and can choose who draws them, they choose the mutineer. And from the brig, they can then choose which mutiny cards to play and handle the cards as best as they can for the human players from there.
So Daybreak brings back the Treachery deck, which we last discussed and was first seen in Pegasus, in the Pegasus expansion. The way it re-implements the Treachery deck is interesting, in so much as they still account negative for most skill checks, so can be used by Cylon players to negatively influence or spike a skill check. But indeed, they now all have skill check abilities, which means that on completing a skill check, they will trigger. And these skill check abilities invariably have negative effects, forcing players to draw additional treachery cards, forcing players to draw mutiny cards, or indeed placing civilian ships from the supply onto the game board.
Speaking of revisiting items from Pegasus, we also see a revisiting of Cylon leaders. And they work in a very similar way, except instead of an agenda, which had a binary loyalty on it and something that had to be achieved, counter to that loyalty. Now with the Cylon leaders in Daybreak, they're dealt motive cards, and they're dealt 4 of them across the course of a game normally. And what they do is they offer conflicting win conditions, as in which side will win the game, and actions that must be completed. But because of the nuance of having 4 of them, with a requirement to have at least 3 of them completed, the loyalties of a Cylon leader are much more difficult to read. And indeed, because only 2 of them are dealt initially, and 2 of them come out at sleeper phase, even the Cylon leader isn't really clear on how they're going to win the game at the beginning, which gives the Cylon leader some of the same intrigue that a human or a Cylon player would have.
So Daybreak also introduces an optional module called the Search for Home option, and this tries to recreate the events in Season 4 of the show when Starbuck goes off to the Demetrius to try and solve the mystery and complete the search for Earth. In this module, the standard distance that you would travel to Kobol, which is 8, is actually replaced with the Earth objective card, and to get there you have to travel 10 distance before jumping again to win the game as the humans. In order to try and make up some of that additional distance, there are mission cards that you can undertake when you board Demetrius. Typically, these will be a very challenging skill check, so sort of a higher difficulty rating than you'd find on the normal crisis cards. So crucially, some of these mission cards will have a distance printed on the bottom, and if you're able to successfully complete these missions, then you can add them onto the distance travelled towards Earth.
There's some really interesting things that come out of that mission deck. and there's components in the box that only relate to one of those missions. For example, the Rebel Battlestar board just relates to a single mission that, if passed by the humans, becomes a Rebel affiliated or human affiliated Battlestar, and if the skill check is failed, then it becomes a Cylon affiliated location. So it's really interesting to see that come out because it's so rare. Those missions just give you some really interesting twists on the game that you'll only see every few games.
One of the other key things with the mission cards that you see on Demetrius is that many of the skill checks count positive if the red or piloting deck cards are played. So this gives pilots another means of playing their piloting cards when there is not much space combat happening.
Yeah, overall it's nice to see more options for pilots, even for doing actions when the board's quiet and there's no silent attacks happening. Something I really like about the Daybreak expansion is it includes a lot of quality of life upgrades, like the Miracle Tokens and the Colonial One overlay, the new silent locations, and the way that it's framed is you just integrate everything, and it all becomes the new baseline for the game, with the exception of the Search for Home objective, which you only use when you need to or want to.
I think overall it's easy to see why a lot of people refer to Daybreak as BSG Second Edition. It really feels like it refines a lot of the elements from the core game. Where it does introduce new things, it does it in a far more sort of cautious and constrained manner. It isn't prone to some of the excesses that we see in Exodus and Pegasus. It re-implements and improves a lot of things that we've seen before, such as Cylon leaders, the treachery deck, skill check abilities, and as we'll talk about in a future episode, it vastly improves the player experience at both 4 and 6 players. Quite rightly, when we were discussing this episode on Board Game Geek, one of the users there, Akmondial, mentions that Daybreak had the benefit of building on the experience of prior expansions, so seeing design elements that worked well and those that worked not so well.
Indeed, in many ways, it seems like Daybreak was meant to be played without the other expansions. When you look at the fact that Daybreak re-implements some of the items, some of the modules in those expansions, and directly conflicts with others, you can see that the Daybreak being implemented by itself, being integrated by itself, seems to be the designer's true intention. And when you play it that way, you see that it pares the game back down to its core experience, especially in terms of character powers, which are more subtle. You're just as likely to pick a base game character as you are a Daybreak character. The execution mechanism is gone, so it removes that element of that extreme action and brings you back to having more intrigue. It doesn't add any new Quorum or Super Crisis cards, so you're maintaining the base game balance in that respect as well. So let's briefly talk about combining expansions. The advice I'd have, perhaps controversially, is don't. I think the expansions are all fantastic, but are best played integrated into the base game by themselves. There are some strange interactions you get that you have to account for when you integrate multiple expansions at once. Easy examples are reckless skill checks from Pegasus, which were clearly supposed to work with the treachery deck provided in that expansion, have an additional action that has to be taken place when they're utilised with the Daybreak treachery deck. Daybreak itself is clearly designed around Cylon attack cards, not the Cylon fleet board, and the treachery deck in Daybreak can actually new to the Cylon fleet board if you integrate those two expansions together. Daybreak being able to give miracle tokens back also means characters like Kane and Callie from Pegasus and Exodus, respectively, are even more powerful. And generally, the combining of expansions dilutes the decks. The mix of food, morale, and fuel crisis is a fine balance and gives players an opportunity to assess the loyalty of the Admiral and the President. And the more chaos introduced into that, the less of a subtle and nuanced game you get.
I think this really hit home for me when, having played with expansions for a long, long time, we actually went back and just played the base game. And I think when you strip all the expansions away, you realise just how well balanced and what a tight experience the base game is. And you start to realise that a lot of the skill cards in your hand have inherent design intent and power. with some of the expansions, you're not even actually reading those skill cards. You're just immediately looking for the more powerful versions that the expansion introduces. Yeah, I think in summary, combining the expansion just gets really very messy very quickly. Part of the attraction for me with BSG is that on an individual player's turn, the range of movements and actions you'll have will be reasonably limited. And I like the fact that the game, when it's flowing well, is relatively quick and feels fairly painless. I think the number of potentially game-breaking rules interactions and additional checks that you'd have to make can just really increase the friction and makes the game feel a lot less fluid.
So you can probably tell from the way we talked about the different expansions is that Daybreak's clearly our favourite, as I think it is for many people. However, don't take the negatives that we've brought up about Pegasus and Exodus to mean that we don't really enjoy those experiences. I will actively choose to play with those expansions on a regular basis and will seek out opportunities to do so. It's just that there are certain elements of them that I think are worth mentioning, and there's a reason why I think most people consider Daybreak to be the essential expansion, unfortunately also the most expensive.
I think if I've not played for a while, Daybreak is always the game mode that I want to come back to. I think it's the most refined game experience. I think if I know that I've got other BSG sessions coming up, I'm more than happy to play with other expansions. As you say, they all offer interesting and exciting ways to play. So in part 2 of our feature this episode, we want to talk through the results of a survey that we conducted on Board Game Geek. And we're very grateful to everybody that took the time to respond to the survey, both in terms of voting and replying to our questions, leaving comments below. It's much appreciated. We were delighted to receive 51 respondents in terms of the votes, and quite a few insightful comments as well on the forum.
So interestingly, when we asked people what their favourite expansion was, we got 56% of people saying they prefer that Daybreak was their favourite, which I suppose is to be expected. One person mentioned the official variant rules being their favourite as well, which is interesting, perhaps because of the no sympathiser rule was the reason for that. When we then asked people what their favourite objective was, as in the destination card, regardless of the expansion being played, by far the biggest favourite was Cobol at 74%. Completely understandable, since playing with the Cobol objective allows you to, even when playing expansion content, fully appreciate that content without having to worry about a new end game or additional mechanics that tend to come in.
Yeah, I was surprised to see Earth not getting higher. I guess that just reflects my own biases. And I suppose thinking about it now, Daybreak is perhaps not super widely available. So maybe maybe that is reflected in the voting as well.
True, but even within the Daybreak rule structure, the search for home is an additional module after you've integrated everything else. And I think some people might look at that and say, 10 distance. It's already a long game. It's going to take some... Obviously, you've then got to shuffle through the mission deck and find ways to close out that additional distance. It might be tempting just to stick with the original destination.
That's very true. That's very true. We were also delighted to see that at least one person voted for New Caprica as their favourite destination. So, not a favourite of mine, but I'm glad to see that it's getting some love from some quarters. If that was you and you voted for New Caprica, we'd love to hear from you. Get in contact with us. Tell us what it is that you love about that particular game module.
Yeah, please get in contact. I'd love to do an episode on revisiting New Caprica and finding out why one person loves it so much. When it came down to asking respondents which expansions they found to be essential, Daybreak was the highest scoring at 56%, but Pegasus and Exodus both came in at 42%, 40% respectively, and 30% people said that none were actually essential.
Yeah, I was surprised at how even this was, really. Daybreak was the overall winner, as you say, but it was a respectable showing from Pegasus and Exodus.
So our fourth question delved a bit deeper into why people feel that some of the expansions are essential. Haytil on the forums rightly pointed out that we had varying levels of granularity with the options we offered people. And the reason it was difficult to pare down each of the modules to its base elements of what it provides, because in some cases it's very specific and in some cases it's very general. So we appreciate you bearing with us and doing your best to respond in the form that we provided. Far and away, the biggest element for expansions being essential came from adding variety and replayability at 72%. And I suppose that's very natural to see that high on BGG because it's fans of the game who are on these forums. So they're likely to play the game more and need that replayability to keep the game interesting. But I'm still surprised to see this be the highest and by far the clear winner. That did surprise me.
So following on from that, the next reasons that people felt made the expansions essential, we've actually got a three-way tie. So coming in at 49% are adds additional options for players during the game, the inclusion of the Cylon Fleet module, and the addition of treachery skill cards. So really different design elements people are picking up on there. So certainly adding additional options for players during the game is important for people that have played it lots of different times that maybe want to try slightly different things. Also receiving 49% of the vote share was the inclusion of the Cylon Fleet module. And this is completely split down the middle, and it's interesting to us. It's certainly a divisive mechanic. Our impression was that this was far more popular, but I think it perhaps just speaks to the fact that people that do advocate for it very strongly, and those not mentioning it, maybe their voices aren't heard as clearly. The last item in joint second place with 49% of the vote share is the addition of the treachery skill cards. We're not surprised to see this being so popular. The addition of the treachery deck really opened up the skill check mechanism, leaving additional ways for Cylons to spike the skill checks and interesting interactions with skill check abilities.
At 46% of the vote, we saw fixes or replacing the sympathizer as the next most popular. I really thought this would be higher because the sympathizer in the base game is so problematic that there have been multiple fixes for it, and many people complain about that mechanism. So I thought that we'd see this a lot higher than 46%, and with 3 of the 4 expansions try to fix it. But perhaps it's just evident that people are playing at 5 players where you don't need the conflicted role, the sympathizer or otherwise, or that people are willing to make those compromises when they can't play at 5. And then finally, worth mentioning is the mutiny, adding mutiny to the game at 44% of the vote, and completely understand it's a great mechanism, works thematically, great stand-up moments for either side, and underpins many of the mechanisms found in Daybreak. A last point to mention is that I did think we'd see investigative committee cards being higher, the new ones provided in Pegasus. I hear a lot of people vocalising how much they prefer the new versions. But again, that might just speak more to the vocality of the proponents of the new cards than it does to just how popular they are. So hopefully this conversation has given you an idea about what's included in each of the expansions and some of the issues you might face when integrating them. If you're a relatively new player, perhaps one with the base game, and you're wanting to know which expansion to purchase, I think what should be obvious, it very much comes down to personal preference about what you enjoy in the game. And if you don't mind a bit of chaos and a bit of power creep, then Pegasus and Exodus may well be for you. Daybreak obviously is the one we'd recommend for the longevity of the game, but it's a lot more expensive. You might end up paying for sealed maybe £300. This is GBP, so convert that into your local currencies. And it's a huge amount of money to be spending on a board game expansion, let alone a board game. So make your own judgments based on that, and where possible, follow the advice we've set up before. Try and play someone else's copy, come and play with us, or find a copy at a board game cafe or a convention if you can, before you decide to put your own money on the line.
If you've listened this far, then thank you very much for joining us. We'd love to use this podcast as a springboard for conversations and interactions about this game, to try and keep it alive as much as possible. To that end, you can find us on X, YouTube, Board Game Geek, and of course you can email us at contact.dradis@gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Thank you.